the Coders Campus podcast, where you'll learn how to code from one of the best teachers in the industry. Whether you're an absolute beginner or a seasoned pro, the Coders Campus podcast will teach you what you need to know to master the art of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow coders, welcome to this episode of the Coders Campus podcast. We've reached episode number 13 now, lucky number 13, and we're going to be continuing our beautiful talk on the beautiful Java version 8 release. So in this episode, we're going to be diving into another, concept that Java 8 has introduced to our, lives as Java programmers. And this one comes in the form of something called default methods. So without, further ado, let's just jive. Let's just dive right into it and get it going. So default methods, what are they? Why should you even care about them? Well, if you're a good programmer and you do as I say and not as I do, then you're going to be a programmer who programs to an interface. It's something that we've always been told is the right thing to do because it promotes a more flexible and extensible design for your programs. When you program to interfaces, more things sort of open up when it comes to the architecture of the application because, well, that's just the nature of interfaces. So I'm sure I've talked about interfaces in the past. I'm sure there's plenty of articles on the Google that will talk about the benefits of programming to an interface versus just creating concrete classes everywhere. So I won't waste your time talking about that. If you already know about it, you don't need to know about it. If you don't know about it, you can go and you can learn about it fairly simply. Yeah. So, but here's the one big issue with the approach of programming to an interface. Before Java 8, so we're talking Java 7 through 1, you had to be extra sure that your interface's design was complete before you released it into the wild. So what the heck do I mean by you need to make sure that your design is complete before releasing it into the wild? Well, let's assume that you've published some code that other people will actually be using. This is typically done via releasing your app as a third-party plugin or a library. Okay, so you're releasing your code, perhaps it's open source, or perhaps it's not open source, but the companies that are purchasing it will need to make use of that library in some way, shape, or form, and will be interacting with your code in their code base. Okay, so that's a situation we are hitting here. So this is, like I said, this is a very common situation for people who are working in the open source community and releasing their code into the wild with other programmers so that other programmers can work on it. Or if you're just working in a really big organization where there's more than 10, 20, 30, 50 developers working in the same code base at the same time. You're going to have other people working with your code and implementing your code and your interfaces. So within the library that you released, you will hopefully include many interfaces because you're a good programmer and you've learned that programming to interfaces is the way to go. So you're going to be including lots of interfaces. And let's say one of these interfaces is called something like MyWidgetService or something like that. It's a service and it's an interface that outlines some sort of service for this widget, whatever that widget is. So for example, you can have a public interface MyWidgetService. And then you define the actual interface. Maybe it's got two methods, just both are void methods. They don't return anything, although they could, be whatever methods you want. Maybe the first method is a void and it says, do something awesome. And we have a second method that's another void and it says do another awesome thing. Okay, so there you go. We've got our widget service, or MyWidgetService. I should be exact with that code. And it interfaces. It has two methods, do something awesome and do another awesome thing. So very technical, very detailed, I know. But that's done. There you go. You've got your interface. You're satisfied with this interface. The functionality it represents is solid. You're ready to rock, and you release it out into the wild as version 1.0 of your platform. Okay? Now people go and they see your MyWidgetService and they, start implementing it in their code. Maybe they build services off of that, implementations of that, and who knows, whatever else they could be building off of that particular interface. This problem that I'm about to talk about comes most commonly from interfaces that are heavily used. So think of interfaces like comparable, serializable. What else? It's other things that you implement on a daily basis. Of course, I'm drawing a blank right now, but there's tons of interfaces that we implement on a daily basis that are everywhere in our code. Okay, so just to picture that, this is what this MyWidgetService represents. It's a service that is being implemented across many, many concrete classes. So everything is fine, everything is going peachy, and then something unexpected happens. Although it shouldn't be unexpected because this is something that obviously always happens. A new feature request comes in. The users using your platform say, hey, I really, that's great, but I really need your interface. It'd be awesome if your interface could do something else. Or not even, they wouldn't even ask for your interface to do something else. They just say, we need this widget service to do something else. And therefore, it makes sense for you to update your interface design. Okay? So suddenly, because of this new feature request that's come in, suddenly your interface is now sort of out of date, and it needs another abstract method inserted inside of it. So let's say we have to, put a third method in there. So we've got the do something awesome, we've got a do another awesome thing, and maybe we need to put a third one in called, do the awesomest thing. Again, I spent long and hard, many hours coming up with the names for these methods. Do the awesomest thing. So what's the issue, right? You you take it and you add it into your interface and be done with it, right? You just say void, do the awesomest thing, put your brackets in there, put a semicolon in, done. You've updated your MyWidgetService and you're happy. Well, hold on, not so fast. Think about this. If you add another method into your interface, every other developer's application, every other concrete class that implements that interface, that relies on your app or whatever, now will break, or at least it has the potential to break. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, wrath hath no fury like a coder scorned. So I should really stop writing these jokes. So this is the problem at large here. When you update an interface with a new abstract method, which means you're just adding in another method into that particular interface, what happens? Well, all of a sudden you get compilation errors all over the place wherever you have a concrete class that implements that method. So if you had a MyWidgetService impl class, so again a concrete class, not an interface, MyWidgetService impl class, which implements MyWidgetService, and you add a new method into the MyWidgetService interface, well, now that concrete class is going to have a compilation error saying, hold on, you haven't implemented all of the methods from the interface, right? Because he just added a new method into that interface. So the concrete classes have no way of automatically implementing those methods that you just added to your interface, right? Well, hold on. Let's introduce default methods. Okay, Java 8 to the rescue. And what's interesting to note here about default methods is this is how Java 8 was able to do what it was able to do with this release. It was able to make updates to all of the collections, interfaces, and frameworks, and a whole bunch of stuff that it changed. It was able to do this because of default methods. And default methods, they allow you to add some actual real functionality to the methods within the body of your method. So there's a lot of method words there. So it's kind of confusing, but to say out loud, but it's actually really, really simple. So one thing that you're not allowed to do in interfaces pre-Java 8 is you're not allowed to define the body of a method inside of an interface. You're not allowed to do that until default methods came around. Default methods now with Java 8 allows you to define the body of the method that belongs to an interface. Right? Cool? Are you happy? Is that exciting? Well, you might not really care all that much, but this is a big deal. So this means that you're going to be able to modify your existing interface by adding a new default method to it. And when you do that, it won't cause any programmers or a programmer uprising, let's say, when you have introduced that code and maybe they update their code base with your new version release of your code base. So that's really what's going on here. Well, you can insert this default method and it won't actually cause any compilation errors anywhere. Okay, so it might seem like a step backwards because really with interfaces you're not supposed to pollute them with actual functionality, actual code, body code, if you will. But this is really, it may seem like a step backwards, but it's a step forwards because it allowed a whole bunch of beautiful things to happen with Java 8. So let's talk about how these beautiful, magical default methods are actually created. So it's really quite simple. All you do is you add the word default before you define your method signature. So you know how we have let's go back to our interface. We have our public interface, MyWidgetService, and it has two methods defined inside of it, the do something awesome and the void do another awesome thing. And we want to add a third method, the void do the awesomest thing. But before we say void do the awesomest thing, we add the word default. So it's default void do the awesomest thing, and then you put your curly brackets, and then you also define the body of the code inside of your default method. So how do you declare body code? Well, you just do your curly brackets, just like you would after creating any other method inside of any concrete class. You just put your code inside of there. Okay, so now with your interface updated with the new default method, all of the implementing classes of this interface, so all the classes everywhere, the concrete classes that implement the MyWidgetService interface, will inherit not only the method, but the actual default functionality of the do the awesomest thing method without any compilation errors whatsoever. So there you go. Problem solved. We can all go home. We can all live happily ever after. Now, I will say a little caveat, a little note. With the code that you're putting inside of your default method, if you're not really implementing any sort of real useful code, then I would imagine it would probably be a good practice to throw some sort of an exception in the body of the method, letting other programmers know that this method hasn't actually been implemented with any useful code. This is a practice I've seen done in the real world where you have some sort of a default class, almost a class that outlines, so it's a concrete class that outlines methods, but they're sort of treating this concrete class like it's an interface. They create the class with all these methods, but all the methods throw an error saying, method not implemented, error, exception, something like that. So not yet implemented or not. I can't remember if it's a built-in error message that they're exception that they're throwing, or if it's probably a custom exception that they have created, and they just extended, whatever it is that you extend when you create an exception. I think do you extend exception or do you extend throwable, or I can't. It's been so long since I've created an exception myself. So, however it is you want to go about doing it, it would probably be a good idea to throw an exception just to say, hey, if someone's actually invoking this method and thinking that it's going to do something useful, but there's been no concrete, implementation of it other than the default implementation, which does nothing, then it's probably a good idea to throw an exception saying, hey, this has not been implemented yet. So, you should do something, to make this do whatever it is that it should be doing. So, anyway, unless you actually implement real world useful code in there, and then, by all means, implement that code, and then you obviously don't need to throw an exception, because then that would be silly. So that's just my 2 cents thrown in there in terms of design for using making use of these default methods. But the other thing that, kind of gets, weird with default methods, in my opinion, is there's not a whole lot that you could actually do with them in terms of real world functional useful code. Because the interface, you can't really, there's no state in the interface. You can't really work with state in an interface. I don't think you can declare, variables, what are they called, class variables or anything inside of an interface, because you're just not allowed to do that. So there's not really much that you can, do with this default method, in my opinion. So, anyway, that's, perhaps that's just because I haven't used them enough to know that there's a whole bunch of other cool things that you can do with them. But in my opinion, the most useful thing is that you can now add new methods to your interfaces without having to cause programmers grief when they then update your code base to, be a more updated version, whatever, if you release version 1.1 with this new interface, then, and then they update from 1.0 to 1.1, then all their code breaks, they won't like that very much. So obviously, like I said, using these default methods is a way around that. Okay. But there's obviously still work that you need to do to implement that interface and that method. So, let me talk a little bit more about the way that you can go about using it, because there's special cases here and there and everywhere when it comes to default methods. So let's say if you have a parent interface that declares a default method, so you have a parent interface, right? And then therefore, since I'm saying you have a parent interface, well, let me turn my phone off. If you have a parent interface that implies that you have a child interface as well. So we have a parent interface that declares a default method, and then you have a child interface that implements that parent interface. Again, parent interface declares a default method. child interface implements the parent. Okay? Then the child interface will also inherit the functionality of its parent's default method. Make sense? It's pretty straightforward, right? The same sort of inheritance, workflow that you would expect to happen when you implement or extend a parent interface. Then you actually will inherit its default methods, and therefore you inherit its default method functionality as well. Unless you decide to override the functionality of the parent's default method in your child interface. Okay, you can do that too. You can have, interface A is the parent interface, or you can call it parent interface. Let's call it that to be explicit. Parent interface defines a default method called do something. The child interface, called child interface, implements parent interface, but then you can override the default method, the do something default method in the child interface by just putting it in there, right? You can just put it in there, and then by default, the child interface's implementation of that default method, the do something method, will be the one that gets used if you implement the interface, right? Cool. And finally, of course, if you override the functionality of an interface's default method in a concrete class, then the implementation of the concrete class is the one that will take precedence when the code is run. Which is, again, this is nothing, out of the ordinary. This is exactly how, inheritance works in Java, and should just make sense that it should work that way, and that is indeed the way it works. So again, there's not really any craziness going on with that kind of thing. So there's no surprises when it comes to implementing the interfaces and how the functionality will work when it comes to default methods in terms of the functionality that you're going to inherit with the default methods functionality. So the body code I'm talking about, what body code is run when you have these situations. That's what I'm sort of getting at. The only situation that is sort of exceptional is if you have, let's say, two interfaces, interface A and interface B, and they both declare a default method called do something. So we have interface A with a default do something method. We have interface B with the default do something method. So they both have the same method name, and they're both default methods. What happens if you implement both interfaces in a concrete class? Well, it's going to give you an exception. That's essentially how Java deals with it, because it's not going to know when you have a concrete class and you implement both interface A and interface B, and you try to execute not even try to execute. You just, I guess, if it's when you try to execute it, I'm not sure actually when you would get that exception. That would be something I'd have to test. I haven't actually tested that, but whether it's when you implement both or when you try to actually run that do something method, so when you try to actually call that method, I don't know which of the two scenarios, but you will definitely get an exception because there's no way Java's going to know which of the two you wanted to run. Okay, which of the two you wanted to make use of. So it's going to say, no, you got to actually be specific and tell me which of the two you actually want to invoke here. And I believe you can tell it, but which one you want to invoke by actually giving the name of the interface. So you can say, interface A dot do something, or interface B dot do something. Okay, you just need to be more specific with your with which one you want to actually call when it comes to the two methods. So anyway, that's sort of, like I said, that doesn't happen very often at all, but hey, if it does happen, that is the way around it. So there's a way around everything, and it, like I said, works beautifully. So yeah, I think this is a very welcome addition to Java 8, and like I said, the whole reason why Java 8 was able to be released and helped us out and didn't break all of our code when they released Java 8 in terms of backwards compatibility, the whole reason was I shouldn't say the whole reason, but a big reason was because of default methods. So I tip my hat to them and throwing that in there. I think it's very useful. So yeah, I think you guys should make use of it if you're in a situation where, like I said, you're working in an open source type of environment and you want to make an update to an existing interface and you don't want to break everyone's code. All right. The other situation is if you're just working in a smaller organization and that interface is not really implemented anywhere other than maybe just one or two places, then it's not a big deal. You don't need to use default methods. You can just insert a new method into the interface, and then you can go and you can update all the concrete classes that implement that particular interface. and just update the code yourself and just, add in the functionality where it needs to be added in. So if you can go and add in all the functionality yourself, then don't make it a default method. That's a bit overkill, right? So there's different scenarios as to when you'd want to use a default method versus when you wouldn't want to use a default method. Or yeah, that's right, method in an interface. Cool? So hopefully that wasn't too confusing to you. It really is pretty straightforward. Like I always say, you can go to the show notes page to get a rundown of, the code and what it looks like. So you can just go to coderscampus.com/13. You'll see all the stuff there. But like I said, pretty straightforward stuff, not overly complicated, but extremely useful. So that's the way I like it. I like it when it's not complicated, but extremely useful and valuable. All right. Wicked. So again, if you haven't checked it out already, check out Coders Campus. Like I said, I've got great stuff, just like what you're learning about here. I've got videos, I've got assignments, I've got tests, I've got a whole bunch of cool stuff inside of my whole Coders Campus library. I'm going to be making some really exciting changes to my Professo platform, which is what's used to host all these courses. One of which is I'm going to actually have a nice way for you guys to go through all the content. Because one thing that I'm sort of realizing is I have like over 160 hours or 150 hours of content in there, which is great. It's a very comprehensive library of tutorials when it comes to teaching you everything from the front end technologies, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, jQuery, Bootstrap, and then all the way to, the business tier like Java, the Java frameworks like Spring Framework, all the Spring Framework, Spring Security, Spring Data, Spring Boot, Spring this, Spring that, and to the, the back end where I talk a lot about MySQL and stored procedures and how to use SQL, how to design, create, and maintain a database. And, anyway, huge library of stuff. The only problem is people come into it and they look at it and they say, oh my God, I don't even know where to begin. So that is something that I want to address. I've gotten to the point where I have too much stuff now and you can look at it and be overwhelmed by all of it. So I'm going to be making some cool changes in the next 60 days or so, where I'm going to be introducing a nice step-by-step plan where you can say, okay, where am I on the timeline? Am I a beginner programmer? Am I an intermediate programmer? What's my goal? Do I want to be a coder that work for a company? Do I want to be a coder who wants to do contracts or whatever? Am I just doing this for fun? Whatever the direction is that you want to go for your future, I'm going to have sort of a plan laid out for you in plain English, where it will take you through all the steps that you need to go through in order to achieve your goal of being, either, like I said, a career programmer or, contract or what have you. So, it'd be a nice step-by-step plan laid out. And I think that's going to be really exciting because that's something that's very valuable and will definitely, beat back the feeling of overwhelm, when it comes to seeing all the stuff that you can get access to inside of Coders Campus. So yeah, really excited about that. Can't wait to be releasing that. So check it out, coderscampus.com. I also have a $1 trial, so you can try it out for 30 days. So you can check that out again, coderscampus.com/trial. Check it out. Enjoy it. Love it. Let me know how you think about it, right? Let me know the feedback. Go ahead, reach out to me. You can reply to any of the emails that I send to you, and I will get them directly in my inbox. I'm still more or less a one-man show, so I see everything that comes in. I read every email, and I love it. I love to do this kind of stuff. So anyway, enough about me, enough about that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to the next episode, which should be 14, where I believe I'm going to be talking about how to take everything that we've learned about Java 8 and apply it to our real-world code. So how do you essentially take your Java 7 or previous code and upgrade it to Java 8 code? So where are the biggest wins? Where can you go and identify code and say, I can probably upgrade this to Java 8 and get some performance benefits and readability benefits and so on and so forth. So I think that's what I'll do in the next episode. It'll be a very hands-on episode, and that'll be, I think, a lot of fun and very useful to all of you. So I look forward to doing that one, hopefully next week. So until then, take care of yourselves, guys. Happy learning, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Coders Campus podcast. But before you go, Trevor has a favor to ask you. In order to keep these episodes free, he'd love for you to leave a rating and review the podcast on iTunes. Just go to coderscampus.com/review to leave your own rating and review of the show. So if you have 30 seconds to spare right now, please help out by leaving a rating and review via coderscampus.com/review. It will ensure that you continue to get these awesome free podcast episodes each and every week. So if you like free swag, head on over to coderscampus.com/review. Happy learning!